Many reasons I am so thankful to be here this evening. One is that I appreciate this continued demonstration of the fine feeling that exists between different institutions that are trying to train men to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. It has been frequently stressed, the cooperation that has taken place between the different churches in this area. I hope also that you have noticed the representatives we've had from various colleges and other schools of preaching upon this platform. Someone well said upon one occasion, there's no competition between lighthouses. So much needs to be done in this particular area that indeed we're thankful for Abilene Christian and all these great schools and the preacher training schools that are helping to do this great work. I'm also very thankful to be here this evening because I appreciate Brother Humble very much. The material, if you happen to have the book on him, is very, very brief. Chairman of the Bible Department at Abilene Christian University. Served as Vice President for Academic Affairs at ACU for 9 years. Educated at Freed-Hardeman, ACU, Colorado, and University of Iowa. Preached in Missouri, Kentucky, and Iowa before joining ACU faculty. Author of film strips on restoration history, archaeology, and Bible geography. Of course, such information just barely touches the hem of the garment. I appreciate Brother Humble personally for a number of reasons. We have a number of mutual interests. I am very, very interested in the restoration history, restoration movement. And as I was working on my own book on that particular subject in Australia, Brother Humble was always very, very willing, very happy to assist me, and we traded some slides and some other information. I appreciate that very much. I consider his small book on this subject a classic, and if you don't have that, you need to have that in your library. Restoration Story, Bill, I've forgotten the exact Restoration Story published by Firm Foundation. I also appreciate those that are supplying and making and involved in making good, top-notch visual aids for our brethren. And the film strip series that he has been associated with are really tremendous. I'm also thankful to be here tonight just because of this topic. A recent poll indicated that one of the topics least preached on today is the judgment. And yet, as you will find from the presentation tonight, it is a topic very frequently on the lips of Jesus Christ. We appreciate Brother Humble personally and look forward to this presentation.
It's always a real joy for me to have a chance to share on the Fort Worth lectures, and especially when I can be on the same program with Brother Hewlin Jackson. When my wife, Jerry, and I were married at the Preston Road Church in Dallas, the Jacksons opened their home for our wedding reception. And Gilly, I was thinking a few moments ago when they mentioned the book that you had written, Despise Not the Little Things, it occurred to me that years ago when you opened your home for our wedding reception, that may have seemed a very little thing to you, but it was a mighty big thing to us. And we're still thankful. 35 years later, we're still thankful. And I certainly appreciated the things that were just said about encouraging a spirit of cooperation among all of our schools of all kinds that are trying to train preachers. And I certainly salute the Brown Trail congregation for all of the money and faith and the energy that you have invested in the training of preachers here. The judgment is sure. That's my sermon tonight. The judgment is sure. And there is no way that all of the schools of all kinds within our brotherhood can turn out as many preachers as we need to sound that message to the world that the judgment is sure. And one thing that I've tried very hard to do is to encourage respect and love and trust and cooperation among all of our Christian colleges and all of our schools of preaching. And therefore I appreciated so much what was said just a few moments ago. Some of you may not be aware of the fact, for example, that one thing that has been done by our Bible faculty at Abilene, with my encouragement, was to adopt a plan where students from Brown Trail or any one of our schools of preaching can transfer to Abilene Christian University and receive college credit for the work that has been done here. If a man finishes your training program, for example, and would like to come on to Abilene and receive his college degree, then we will give him somewhere between 24 up to possibly 50 semester hours of college credit toward his degree for the work that has been done here. And so I certainly do respect very much the work that is being done at Brown Trail and our other schools of preaching. The question tonight is, what did Jesus teach about the judgment? Much, very much. And if you should go back and reread the four Gospels just to try to find the answer to that question, what did Jesus teach about the judgment, you probably would be astonished at the fact that Jesus mentions it so often. He said, "The words that I've spoken, the same will judge you in the last day." He told about the wheat and the tares growing together in the field. But at the harvest, they're going to be separated and the tares are going to be thrown into the fire. He said that the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea that drags in fish of every kind, and then they're separated and the bad are thrown away. And so many times Jesus separates all of mankind into two great groups, the good and the bad, the wheat and the chaff, the broad way and the narrow way, the foolish virgins and the wise virgins, the sheep and the goats, and on it goes. But even though the teaching about judgment runs like a thread through nearly everything that Jesus taught, the longest single discourse that Jesus ever gave about judgment is found in Matthew 24 and 25. And we're going to confine our study tonight to those two chapters. And as I walked in, I noticed that many of you have Bibles with you. If you do, open them to Matthew 24. And I'm sure that our study will mean a little more to you tonight if you have your Bibles open to Matthew 24 and 25 as we work through those two chapters together. Jesus' longest discourse, longest teaching about the judgment. The context of these two chapters is the last week of Jesus' life. The triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem on Sunday has already taken place. Those final arguments between Jesus and his critics, they had already taken place. And now Jesus and his disciples are in the temple area. They've been there together so many times. They were talking about the temple. And well, they might talk about the temple, for what a magnificent building it was. Herod the Great had begun construction work on the temple in 20 BC, and now, 50 years later, the work was still underway. The Temple Mountain itself had not been large enough for all of these grandiose building plans of Herod the Great, and so he had built a great artificial retaining wall all the way around the Temple Mountain. They had filled that in to make the mountain larger and bigger. And there are parts of that great retaining wall that are still there today. You've heard of it, called the Wailing Wall today, put there before the birth of Jesus by Herod the Great. 2 years ago, archaeologists were working at the north end of what is the Wailing Wall, excavating some of that great Herodian building that had not been uncovered for 1,900 years. And they found one great block of stone about 40 feet long, weighing an estimated 415 tons. They've actually found the quarry where that great block of stone was cut, 1/2 mile away. How could ancient people cut a block of stone weighing 415 tons and then move it to that location where it was recently discovered? The temple building itself, about as tall as a 15-story building, covered with white marble, decorated all the way around the top with gold. Josephus said that it looked like a snowy mountain glittering in the sunshine. Magnificent building. They were talking about it. And yet, Jesus said in verse 2, the time would come when not one single stone would be left standing on another. It would be destroyed completely. The idea of the destruction of the temple was so unthinkable to the disciples. They asked the Master, verse 3, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age, the end of the world?" The end of the temple, the destruction of that magnificent sanctuary, was so unthinkable to those disciples that they could only associate it with the second coming and the end of the world and the destruction of all things. They were confused. And yet across the ages, many, many other people have been confused by many of the things found here in Matthew 24 and 25. There's a great Baptist scholar that some of you have heard of, Beasley Murray, who has called these two chapters the greatest problem anywhere in the Gospels. But they asked Jesus, what will be the sign that these things are about to happen? And Jesus gave them a series of 7 signs, beginning at about verse 5. In order for you to understand this great discourse in Matthew 24 and 25, you've got to understand that Jesus is talking about 2 judgments. They're clearly separated. The first one is the judgment of God on the Jewish people, on the city of Jerusalem. And that judgment came in the year 70 A.D., when the prediction of Jesus was fulfilled explicitly, and when that magnificent building that they assumed would stand forever, when that magnificent building was totally and utterly destroyed by the Roman forces. And as Jesus says, not a single stone was left standing on another. That was the first judgment. The second judgment is the one that is yet to come, the end of time, the judgment of all mankind everywhere. Those disciples, when Jesus says, this is going to be destroyed completely, they were so confused and perplexed, they said, what will be the signs that these things are about to happen? And Jesus gives a series of 7 signs beginning in verse 5. Verse 5, false Christs. Verse 6, wars, rumors of wars. Verse 7, famines, earthquakes. Verse 9, persecution of Christians. They'll deliver you up to tribulation and to death. Verse 11, many false prophets will arise. Verse 14, the word of the gospel of the kingdom, is going to be preached throughout the whole world. Those are 7 general signs. They can be called general signs because they have occurred over and over again in church history. They certainly occurred within the lifetime of those disciples. In the book of Acts, we read about famines all over the Roman Empire. We know from ancient history that there were great earthquakes at Pompeii and Laodicea in the 1st century. We know that under Nero the disciples were persecuted, and yet we know from the writings of Paul that the gospel was still preached all over the Roman Empire within that generation. These general signs have happened over and over again. There are some people that confuse what Jesus taught here, and they assume that these are signs pointing to the second coming of Christ, the final judgment. And when they see these signs occurring within their own day, they begin to shout, the second coming of Christ is imminent, it's about to happen. You can hear that today. William Miller made that mistake back in the 1840s, and people are still making that mistake today. But these 7 signs are signs not of the final judgment, but of the judgment of God on Jerusalem that came in 70 A.D. Then in verse 15, there's a more specific sign. It is called the abomination of desolation, or the desolating sacrilege. The language is taken from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. And this might be extremely confusing were it not for the parallel passage that we have in Luke's Gospel, which says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that her destruction is nigh. What Jesus is warning the disciples here is very simple. When you see the Roman army invading the land, and when you see that army about to tighten the noose around Jerusalem, know that the judgment on that city is nigh. Know that and flee. He gives instructions. Don't even go back into your home. Don't go back into the city, but flee immediately. We know that the early Christians were well warned by all of that. And we learn from the ancient church historian Eusebius that when the Christians in Jerusalem saw the Roman armies about to lay siege, they fled en masse. They left the city, went over into the Jordan Valley to the little city of Pella, established new homes there, and did not suffer in the destruction of Jerusalem. In the Lectureship book, I've quoted this statement from the historian Eusebius, who wrote in the 4th century. He said, "Those who believed on Christ migrated from Jerusalem to Pella, that when holy men had altogether deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea, the judgment of God might overtake them for all of their crimes against Christ and his apostles." Eusebius and the other early Christians saw the destruction of Jerusalem as the judgment of God on that city and that nation for their crimes against Jesus Christ and the gospel. And the Christians fled. The Jews, on the other hand, assumed that they would find safety in that great walled city. And therefore thousands of people fled to the city. And the city was packed with people when the Roman siege was laid. The result was starvation, suffering, disease, death that is just almost unbelievable. Josephus says that in that siege of Jerusalem that ended in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, Josephus says that more than 1 million Jews died in the city. And the 97,000 who survived went into slavery. And God's judgment had been visited on that city. In verse 34, if you're following with me, in verse 34, we come to a verse that one scholar, Marcellus Kick, has called the time text of this chapter. For Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place." All of these things that have been described up to this point are going to occur within the lifetime of this generation, the destruction of Jerusalem. And then from that verse onward, he will turn to the final judgment, the end of time upon all mankind. And yet, there are very serious problems here. It's not an easy passage by any means. Barclay says, for example, that there are some verses here that are as difficult as any verses to be found in the New Testament. When we go back up to verse 29, for example, immediately after the tribulation of these days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the heaven, the powers of the heaven will be shaken, the sign of the Son of Man will appear. And on the surface, were it not for verse 34, that sounds very much like the second coming of Christ and final judgment. Brother Ian Fair did a study of this passage at our ACU lectureship only last February. And Brother Fair tried to establish the fact that this is apocalyptic language, similar to language that is found many times in the Old Testament. You can find similar language in Isaiah and Ezekiel involving the destruction of Babylon and the destruction of Egypt. The sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling. That's the apocalyptic language that is used also in the Old Testament for God's destruction on the great cities of that day. And if this is true, then what Jesus is saying in this passage is very clear. When the Roman armies came, when Jerusalem was destroyed in that awful siege, it was not just another war. It was not just another event in ancient history. What occurred there was the judgment of God visited upon them for their rejection of the Messiah. God had come in judgment on Jerusalem. Come to verse 36. And this verse has sometimes been called the transition text of the chapter. Verse 34 is the time text. What precedes that? The destruction of Jerusalem. What follows? The final judgment. But in verse 36, we come to the transition text from one judgment to the other. For Jesus says, "Of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, not the Son, but the Father only. The disciples had asked, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? They were confusing the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple with the final coming of Christ in judgment. And they asked, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? And Jesus answers, in effect, the angels don't know. I don't know when. Only the Father knows. And therefore, if Jesus did not know the time of his second coming in judgment, there obviously could be no signs to mark the second coming. The word that is used in verse 37 for the coming of the Son of Man, coming, the word there is particularly interesting. It's a Greek word, parousia, that was used in ancient literature for the coming of a king or the coming of an emperor to his subjects. It's used 4 times in this chapter for the second coming of Christ. And this is the only place that it's used in the Gospels, though it's used very often in the epistles to describe the second coming of Christ. But Jesus is saying, I don't know. The angels do not know. I've given you signs, many of them, by which you can know that the destruction of Jerusalem is drawing near. But signs for my second coming, there are none. I do not know. And so, if there is one great teaching that Jesus gives about his second coming and the judgment in these 2 chapters, it is the sudden unexpectedness of it. No one knows. No one can know when it's going to be. And after that transition text in verse 36, Jesus uses 6 illustrations to say, my coming is going to be sudden and unexpected. You just can't know when it's going to be. 6 illustrations, and here they are. In verse 38 and 39, it's going to be like the time of Noah. 2 men in the field, one will be left, the other will be taken. 2 women grinding at the mill, one will be taken, the other will be left. Verse 43, it's going to be like a thief that breaks into your home at night. Unexpected, terrifying. Several years ago, when Jerry and I were living in Kansas City and I was preaching for one of the churches there, I learned exactly what that passage means. We learned it the hard way. We went home from midweek service just like this. Didn't have this many people, but we had been to the midweek service and went home that night, and I went to the hall closet to hang my coat up, opened the door, and the hangers were in disarray and the closet was empty. And I'd been gone for a week, just got back home that day, so I yelled at Jerry and said, have you cleaned out this closet while I've been gone? No. Why? And then I quickly looked around the room and saw all kinds of signs. The television had been moved. There were things strewn against the across the living room floor. And suddenly, I realized someone has been here. A robber, a thief has been in our home during the last hour. It's a terrifying experience. I even saw a man dart from one... No, I did. I thought I did. I just knew that I saw a man dart from one room to the other. You talk about it being unexpected, and you talk about it being terrifying. That's the second illustration that Jesus uses. The judgment is going to be like a thief that breaks into your home at night. Verse 45 is the third illustration. It's going to be like a master that demands a reckoning with his servants. One is faithful, the other is wicked. Then in chapter 25, 3 more illustrations of the unexpectedness of the coming and the judgment. And these 3 parts of chapter 25 are so familiar. First, the 10 virgins. The second part of it, parable of the talents. And the final part of it, the final separation between the sheep and the goats. Those 3 sections of Matthew 25 are so familiar that I'm sure many of you have studied them, been through that chapter many times. In the context of our study tonight, they're all illustrations that Jesus uses to say, my coming and the final judgment will be so sudden and so unexpected. And I'd like to take just enough time tonight to suggest one lesson from each one of these parts of Matthew 25. The second coming and the judgment is going to be like the 10 virgins. The marriage customs of the ancient world obviously are quite different from our marriage customs today, suggesting the fact that they lived in a different world with a different way of life, and that different world is used to illustrate all of the parables of Jesus. Back in that day, the young man and the young woman did not hurry away from their reception at the Jacksons and slip off somewhere for a honeymoon. No, in the ancient world, they did the very opposite. The young couple invited all of their friends, and they came together, and the festivities went on for a full week of celebration with all of their friends. It was a very joyous time. The rabbis even say that a man could abandon the study of the law for a week to share in the joy of the marriage celebration. The bride and her friends waited at her home. They didn't know when the bridegroom was going to come. That was a part of the game. He tried to slip up on them and catch them napping. That's exactly what happened in the parable here. At midnight, there's the cry, the bridegroom cometh. Come ye out to meet him. And those 10 virgins took their flashlights, little oil lamps, to meet the bridegroom. Some of you have seen those little oil lamps. I intended to bring one tonight and forgot to. But the oil lamps in the first century are very small, 2 or 3 inches in diameter. They'll just fit into the palm of one's hand, and you carry it around for a little bit of light. They would hold only a small amount of oil. And very soon the lamps began to flicker out, and 5 of the virgins had brought no oil along with them. And they tried to borrow, and they couldn't. They tried to go out and buy some at midnight. When they finally got back, the door was closed. They were left out. It was too late. The meaning of all of this, Jesus himself gives in verse 13. Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Judgment is sure, but you don't know when. And I don't know when. And Jesus doesn't know when. And the lesson that the Lord himself gave in this parable about judgment is watch, because you don't know when it's going to be. And the only way to be ready is to be watchful all the time. And that's so hard today, so difficult in our secular society. There are so many things in the New Testament that indicate that the early church lived in real expectancy. There was a sense of real expectancy among those early Christians. Jesus is going to come. Let's be ready. Nearly 2,000 years have gone by, and we seem to have lost that sense of expectancy. And it's so hard to be watchful today. We live in a society that is so oriented to the secular. We're so affluent. We have so much of the good life that to live in constant expectation that the judgment might occur anytime, that's so difficult for us. But so important. It's so important that we live lives of watchfulness for a couple of reasons. One is there's some things you just can't find at the last minute. The virgins found that out about their oil, and you and I can find that out. There's some things you just can't find at the last minute. If we have a student out at ACU that signed up for a course in calculus, and if he neglects homework for a semester, he's going to find out that he can't learn a semester of calculus 5 minutes before the final exam. You can't do it. And a Christian cannot cultivate a life of holiness the last day before Jesus comes. Can't do it. Queen Mary of Orange was on her deathbed. Her royal chaplain was trying to talk to her about her soul and her salvation, and she said, I have not saved this matter to this hour, and we'd better not. We'd better be watchful all the time. And we'd better be watchful because there are some things you can't borrow. There are some things you can't borrow from others. Being a Christian, young people, is the most personal thing on earth. You may have been richly blessed by having a loving Christian mother and father, but you can't borrow the Christian life and preparation from them. You can be inspired by their example. But one of the things that we cannot borrow is Christian life and being ready for the Lord. That's the most personal thing in the world. And the lesson about judgment that is found in the parable of the 10 virgins is watch always. The lesson that is found in the parable of the talents is stewardship. You know the story. Man called his servants to him, gave one 5 talents, 2 1 talent, went away into a far country, much later came back and demanded a reckoning with those servants. Because of this parable, the word talent in our English language has come to mean commonly an ability, a natural endowment, the talents, the abilities that I have. That's not what the word talent means in the New Testament. It was a weight, and therefore a sum of money, about 60 pounds. So that 1 talent, somewhere around 60 pounds of gold or even silver, that's an awful lot of money the master entrusted to these servants. Later, he demanded the reckoning. 2 of them had worked, doubled what they had received. They were blessed. The other man assumed that his master was a bad, hard-hearted man. He had done nothing. He had hidden the talent, and he was punished. And the lesson that you and I can see about judgment is a lesson about stewardship. As the master had entrusted to those servants large sums of money, so our master has entrusted to us abilities, aptitudes, talents to be used in his service. What I am is a gift of God. What I can do is a gift of God. And God expects me to use it in his service. And if I don't, I will have failed miserably when that judgment comes. We don't all have the same ability and the same talent today. Sometimes we assume that everyone in the church ought to be able to do exactly the same thing in the same way. There are some people that have a great talent to go out and knock doors and talk to people in personal Bible studies, and that's great. But if they assume that everyone in the congregation ought to be able to do that as well as they can do it, they're expecting something the Lord doesn't expect. Some choose to go overseas and be missionaries and preach the gospel overseas, and I praise God for the faith of all of those people. But if they come home and lay a bit of guilt on all of those that don't go overseas, they're just assuming that everyone in the kingdom ought to be doing exactly the same thing. And that's not really the way it works. But the lesson of the talents is that whatever ability God has given me, stewardship, God expects me to use it in his service. And I suppose the very worst thing that I can do is to do nothing. Bury my talent and do nothing. It seems to me that Jesus teaches here and many other places that it would be far better to put my ability to work as a steward in God's kingdom, make mistakes and fall on my face and do things that I ought to do. It would be far better to do that than to sit back and do nothing. Is there any sin that is more damning than the sin of doing nothing? The lesson of this parable about judgment is stewardship. And when you and I stand before the Lord, and we will, who knows when, and we will, the Lord will want to know, have you used for me what I've given to you? The last teaching about judgment, probably the most familiar of all. You've heard these verses read many, many times, I'm sure, beginning at verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in His glory and all the angels with Him will sit on His throne, all the nations are going to be gathered before Him. He'll separate them like the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep on the right hand and the goats on the left hand, and the King will say to those on the right hand, come, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And the righteous will say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, thirsty, give you drink, and so on? And the Lord will say that as much as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. The lesson here, service to others. Judgment will be concerned about our service to others. Has it ever disturbed you at all what Jesus mentions explicitly here as the basis of judgment? Feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, visiting and assisting those that are sick and ill-clad and in prison and so on. And have you stopped to think how many things that have loomed so large in our preaching across the years are not even mentioned in this picture of the judgment scene? Nothing about baptism or the church or the weekly communion. Not a word about instrumental music or marriage and divorce or the qualifications of elders, and on I could go. Am I implying that those things are unimportant? Oh no, not at all. We all know the emphasis that is placed in the New Testament on sound doctrine and the life of the body. I'm not minimizing any one of those things for a moment. But I am saying that if we take seriously the picture of judgment that Jesus gives here, then if the message that sounds from our pulpits is a message that emphasizes the right doctrines, but ignores the importance of our being to service to others, that message is not really the whole message of the New Testament. I was hungry and thirsty, and you served me. That's what judgment is all about. Barclay recalls a legend from the Middle Ages that beautifully illustrates this passage. The story is about a man named Martin of Tours. He was a Christian who lived in France in the 4th century. He was a Christian. He was also a soldier in the Roman army. One time, Martin of Tours was going into the city of Amiens in France. He was stopped by a beggar, and the beggar pleaded with him for an alms. Martin didn't have a single coin with him, no money. He was wearing a Roman soldier's cloak. It was old and worn and tattered, but it was a cold wintry day, and he saw that beggar was shivering with the cold, and he took the cloak off of his own back, cut it in two, gave half to the beggar, kept half for himself, went his way. That night he dreamed, and in his dream he saw heaven. And he saw Jesus in all of the glory of heaven, with all of the majesty that one can see in heaven. But there was one thing that was strange. Jesus was wearing an old, tattered, torn garment. And one of the angels came to Jesus and said, Master, why are you wearing that tattered, torn old cloak? Who gave it to you? And Jesus answered softly, Martin, my servant, gave it to me. Inasmuch as you've done it on one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it to me. In Matthew 25, there are 3 great lessons about judgment. First, watchfulness. Second, stewardship. Third, service to others. And if you and I can hear those words of Jesus, and if we can build our lives upon them, then when Jesus comes in judgment, as he will, it'll be a time of welcome joy and not terrifying suddenness. Are you ready? I don't know when he'll come. Could be tomorrow. Sometime it will be tomorrow. Sometime it will be today. The only way to be ready then is to be ready now. Are you ready? If not, will you come as we sing?